There are families whose names echo through the centuries with prestige, admiration, or wealth. Then, there are families whose names evoke nothing but dread, whispered in hushed tones as though speaking them aloud might summon the curse tied to their blood. The Hartwell family belonged to the latter. To this day, their story lingers in fragments of local folklore, in yellowing newspaper clippings, and in the silent decay of their once grand estate. For some, the Hartwell legacy is a reminder of human cruelty. For others, it is proof that some curses are real, stretching across generations like dark vines strangling everything they touch. The Hartwell estate stood tall on the outskirts of a quiet New England town during the 19th century, a place where God-fearing people lived orderly lives. The Hartwells were outsiders from the very beginning, arriving with wealth that no one could fully account for. Their mansion loomed over the town like a fortress, a towering reminder that not all prosperity was earned by honest means. Yet what intrigued, and later terrified, people most was not the grandeur of the Hartwells' home, but the tragic pattern that followed the women who dared to become part of the family. Edward Hartwell, the patriarch at the heart of this tale, was not known for kindness or warmth. He was a man of stern demeanor, commanding respect in business and fear in his household. Outwardly, he was successful, charming, even generous in moments. But those who crossed the threshold of his estate noticed something else, a heavy stillness in the air, as though the house itself disapproved of their presence. His wives, 5 in total, would all learn this truth too late. The tragedies began quietly, almost like isolated accidents of fate. A fragile woman, perhaps too sensitive for the harshness of marriage, lost her mind. Such things were not unheard of in the 1800s. But when it happened again and again, the town could no longer look at the Hartwell name without suspicion. Each wife entered the estate a woman of promise, full of grace and charm, and each one left the world broken, raving, or locked away in asylums where they would never recover. Madness became the family's shadow, a haunting rhythm repeated with dreadful consistency. Eleanor, the first wife, descended from elegance into trembling paranoia. She swore she heard voices in the corridors at night, voices that whispered her name. The second wife, Margaret, lost her ability to speak, retreating into silence that ended only in her death. Catherine, the third, claimed to see visions, terrible ones, that left her screaming at shadows. Isabella, the fourth, was consumed by night terrors, awake for days until her body could no longer endure. And Anne, the fifth and final wife, unraveled so slowly that her deterioration seemed almost orchestrated, as though someone, or something, was carefully pulling apart the threads of her sanity. The Hartwell mansion became notorious, not merely for the misfortunes within its walls, but for the way the tragedies mirrored one another. The wives' suffering followed a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. Neighbors whispered about a curse, a family debt owed to the devil, or sins buried so deep in the Hartwell bloodline that no confession could wash them away. Some believed the house itself was alive, a vessel of suffering feeding on the delicate minds of the women who lived there. Others pointed their fingers at Edward Hartwell, wondering whether the true horror was not supernatural at all but human in nature, a husband whose charm concealed a monstrous cruelty. By the late 1800s, the Hartwell name had become synonymous with dread. Young women in town shuddered at the idea of marrying into the family, and parents warned their daughters never to be seduced by promises of wealth and security. Still, Edward continued to remarry, as though defying the curse itself, daring fate to take another woman under his roof. And fate never disappointed. What makes the Hartwell story enduring is not only the tragedy of the women who lost their lives and minds, but the questions that remain unanswered. Was Edward a manipulative man who drove his wives insane through cruelty, isolation, and psychological torment? Or was there truly something darker at work, something woven into the very foundation of the estate, beyond human understanding? The story of the Hartwells is not simply about madness. It is about the nature of evil, whether born in the human heart or summoned from forces unseen. It is a tale that reminds us of how fragile the human mind can be when trapped between fear and isolation. The Hartwell wives were not merely victims of circumstance. They were mirrors reflecting the sinister power that had rooted itself in the family's legacy. As the town around them grew and changed, the mansion stood still, a relic of the Hartwells' dark history. Its windows looked out onto the world like hollow eyes, its halls echoing with the silence of those who once screamed within them. To enter the estate was to step into a graveyard of sanity, a place where love turned into torment and marriage vows became sentences of doom. The Hartwell name may have faded with time, but their story lingers like a ghost, an eternal reminder that some families carry legacies of horror instead of honor. And in the case of the Hartwells, that horror came in the form of 5 wives who all went insane, leaving behind a question that still chills those who dare to ask, was it madness born of man? Or of something far worse? Eleanor Hartwell arrived at the great mansion with the kind of hope that only young brides could carry in their hearts. She was beautiful in a quiet way, her presence soft and warm, a balance to Edward Hartwell's sharp demeanor and commanding voice. When she first stepped into the towering foyer of the estate, she was awed by its grandeur. Sweeping staircases, heavy velvet curtains, walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors who seemed to watch her every move. The house was cold, though it was mid-summer, and she remembered shivering slightly as Edward's hand rested on her back, guiding her forward. To her, it felt like stepping into a life of promise. But for those who knew the whispers surrounding the Hartwells, it was as though she had walked into a cage. In the early days, Eleanor tried to bring light into the house. She arranged flowers in vases, opened windows to let in the sun, and played the piano in the grand parlor. Her laughter filled the halls where silence had reigned, and for a short time, she believed she could tame the stillness of the mansion with warmth. But she soon discovered that the house resisted her efforts. The flowers wilted faster than they should have. The curtains seemed to close themselves, no matter how wide she drew them. The sound of her piano keys lingered unnaturally, echoing long after her fingers had left the notes. She began to sense that her cheer was not welcome here. The servants spoke little, keeping their eyes lowered as though afraid to meet hers. When she tried to engage them in conversation, they would answer in short replies before retreating quickly. Eleanor thought it strange, but assumed they were simply shy. Only later would she wonder whether they feared something else entirely. At night, when she lay beside Edward, she would hear faint noises in the corridors outside their chamber, soft footsteps when no one should be walking, a sigh like breath against the door. Edward dismissed her worries with a wave of his hand. Old houses made strange sounds, he told her. She mustn't let her imagination run away with her. But Eleanor's imagination was not to blame. The strangeness began to take shape in ways that could not be ignored. One evening, she woke to find Edward sitting in a chair beside the bed, staring at her while she slept. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and distant. When she asked what he was doing, he replied that he was watching over her, ensuring she did not fall prey to nightmares. Though his words were tender, his tone carried an edge that unsettled her. She turned away, trying to sleep, but she could not shake the feeling that she was less a wife and more a specimen under observation. As the weeks passed, Eleanor began to feel eyes on her wherever she went. The ancestral portraits, with their shadowed gazes, seemed alive. When she crossed the halls, she sometimes heard faint whispers, indistinguishable but persistent, as though the house itself were speaking in a language she could not understand. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, but then came the night when she entered the east corridor and saw a woman standing at the end of it. The figure was pale, her gown torn, her hair wild around her face. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering, but before she could call out, the figure dissolved into the shadows. She fled back to her room, breathless, but Edward only scolded her for being fanciful when she told him what she had seen. His dismissals hurt her deeply. She began to question herself, wondering if she truly was imagining things. Yet the fear would not leave her. She stopped wandering the halls after dark, keeping to the safety of her room. But the strange occurrences followed her there. She awoke one night to find her rosary, which she kept on her bedside table, lying broken on the floor. Another morning, the mirror above her vanity was cracked straight through the center, though she swore it had been whole the day before. The servants refused to comment on these things, and Edward grew impatient whenever she raised them. Slowly, Eleanor began to feel isolated, cut off from the world beyond the mansion's gates. She no longer played the piano, no longer arranged flowers. The laughter she had once carried seemed to vanish, replaced by a quiet dread that clung to her even in daylight. Her dreams became troubled, filled with visions of women screaming, their faces blurred but their voices sharp, calling her name. Sometimes, She woke to find herself standing in the middle of the hallway, with no memory of leaving her bed. Edward's demeanor grew colder as Eleanor's fears worsened. He spent long hours locked in his study, leaving her alone with her anxieties. When he did engage with her, his words were cutting, dismissing her concerns as hysteria. In public, he was charming, presenting himself as the devoted husband, but behind closed doors, he treated Eleanor's terror as weakness. She began to feel that she was unraveling not only because of the house, but because of the man she had married. Her paranoia deepened until it consumed her entirely. She stopped eating, claiming the food was poisoned. She refused to look into mirrors, insisting that someone else's face stared back at her. She scratched symbols into the walls of her chamber, strange markings she claimed would ward off the voices. Servants whispered among themselves, and Edward, embarrassed, ordered that Eleanor be confined to her room. The woman who had once filled the mansion with light and music now sat in darkness, muttering to herself, her once beautiful features hollowed by fear. The final breaking point came one stormy night when Eleanor was found screaming at the top of the staircase, her eyes wide with terror. She swore she saw women crawling up the stairs toward her, their hands clawing at her dress, their mouths open in silent screams. The servants had to drag her back, while Edward stood watching from the landing, his face as unreadable as ever. Within days, Eleanor was sent away to a sanatorium, her mind shattered beyond repair. She never returned to the Hartwell estate, and in time, she faded into the obscurity of medical records and whispers. But her story did not fade. The town remembered her as the first of the Hartwell wives who lost her sanity, the woman whose decline was too sudden, too strange to be explained by mere fragility. Some claimed the house had claimed her mind, feeding on her fears until nothing was left. Others said Edward himself had orchestrated her madness, breaking her spirit with cold cruelty until she lost touch with reality. Whatever the truth, Eleanor's fate set the tone for what would follow. She was the first to fall, but she would not be the last. Margaret came into Edward Hartwell's life not long after Eleanor was sent away. Where Eleanor had been soft and delicate, Margaret was composed and sharp, with an air of resilience that seemed to suit Edward's coldness better. She was intelligent, well-educated, and carried herself with dignity. To the townsfolk, it seemed Edward had found balance in his second marriage, a woman who could stand beside him without crumbling. To Margaret herself, the marriage appeared to be an opportunity to rise in status, to preside over the great Hartwell mansion and leave her mark upon it. But those who had seen Eleanor's decline could not help but watch her with pity, for they suspected the house would not allow her to thrive for long. From the moment she stepped through the doors, Margaret felt the weight of the estate press against her chest. Though she did not believe in superstition, there was an undeniable heaviness to the halls, an unshakable sense that the walls contained secrets best left untouched. She dismissed it as nerves, telling herself she would grow used to the atmosphere. Unlike Eleanor, she was not one to fill silence with laughter. She embraced the quiet, believing that her disciplined nature would not falter in the face of the mansion's stillness. But silence, she would learn, could be far more dangerous than sound. At first, Margaret ran the house with precision. She directed the servants with efficiency, ensured dinners were held at proper times, and organized the Hartwell ledgers with meticulous care. Edward seemed satisfied, though his affections remained distant. His attentions focused more on his study than his wife. Margaret told herself it did not matter. She had not married for romance, but for stability and position. Still, she could not ignore the way her husband often watched her, not with love, but with the same cold scrutiny Eleanor had once described before her mind had unraveled. In her early weeks, Margaret began to notice peculiarities. The servants avoided speaking in her presence unless directly addressed, and when they did, their words carried a clipped tone, as if carefully chosen to avoid revealing too much. Sometimes, when Margaret entered a room, she would find two of them whispering in hushed tones, only to fall silent the moment she appeared. She tried to assert her authority, but the unease in their eyes made her feel less like their mistress and more like an intruder. The silence of the mansion grew oppressive. During the day, Margaret moved through the halls to the sound of her own footsteps, echoing endlessly until she felt as though the house were mocking her with the repetition. At night, the stillness became unbearable. She would lie in bed, her ears straining, and the silence would stretch until it felt alive, pulsing with something unspeakable. Sometimes she heard faint tapping, as if fingernails scratched against the walls just beyond her chamber. Other times, she swore she heard her own name whispered faintly in the darkness, though Edward remained fast asleep beside her. One evening, while exploring the library, Margaret found a journal tucked between ledgers on a high shelf. Its pages were filled with erratic writing, the words slanting wildly, the ink blotched as if written in haste. At first, she assumed it belonged to Edward's ancestors, but then she found Eleanor's name written in the margins, again and again, surrounded by fragments of sentences that spoke of shadows, whispers, and silence that devoured. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the pages, realizing this must have been Eleanor's journal during her decline. She slammed the book shut and shoved it back into its hiding place, determined not to let herself fall into the same trap of delusion. She would not allow herself to become weak, but the journal haunted her. At night, the words replayed in her mind. She tried to focus on practical matters, but the house seemed to resist her authority. Doors she shut would stand open in the morning. Rooms she had tidied would be in disarray when she returned. The servants refused to acknowledge it, insisting nothing had changed. Margaret began to question whether they were complicit in whatever curse lingered here, or whether they, too, were trapped by it. Her dreams became the first true sign of her unraveling. She dreamed of rooms she had never entered, of corridors that twisted endlessly, leading her deeper into the house until she no longer knew where she was. In these dreams, she always heard a chorus of women whispering, their words too soft to understand, but their tone filled with sorrow. When she woke, the whispers lingered in her ears. One night, she dreamed she was gagged, unable to speak, and when she woke, her jaw ached as if she had clenched it all night. During the day, Margaret began to lose her voice. At first, it was only a hoarseness that made her words difficult to project, but soon it became harder to speak at all. Her throat tightened when she tried to call to the servants, her words emerging as little more than a rasp. Edward looked upon her with mild annoyance, accusing her of feigning illness. Margaret insisted something was wrong, but he dismissed her claims as hysteria. Her frustration built, but the harder she tried to speak, the more her voice seemed to fail her. The silence that had once seemed manageable now grew unbearable. Margaret would try to scream into the night, desperate to hear sound, but only air escaped her throat. She began writing notes to the servants, but they often pretended not to understand them, shaking their heads and turning away. She felt herself trapped in a prison of muteness, her words swallowed by the house itself. Soon, her isolation became complete. Edward stopped dining with her, choosing instead to take his meals alone in his study. The servants avoided her as if she carried some disease. Alone in her chamber, Margaret began to claw at her throat until her fingernails left raw marks upon her skin. Her journal entries, written in a frantic scrawl, grew darker, her once disciplined handwriting dissolving into jagged lines. She wrote of the silence as if it were alive, as if it were consuming her piece by piece. One night Edward found her in the dining hall, standing on the table, her hands clutching her throat as tears streamed down her face. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, only a rasp of breath. Edward's expression was not one of concern but of contempt, as if her suffering was an inconvenience. Within days, Margaret was confined to her room, her condition dismissed as madness. She spent her final weeks scratching words into the walls, desperate to leave some record behind, but even her writing grew illegible as her mind deteriorated. Eventually, Margaret disappeared from the mansion, just as Eleanor had. Some said she was sent to a sanatorium, others whispered she had been buried quietly in the family plot. But the truth was never spoken aloud. What the town remembered was the silence, the once proud and disciplined Margaret reduced to a mute shadow, swallowed whole by the Hartwell estate's suffocating stillness. When Isabella became Edward Hartwell's third wife, whispers spread quickly through the town. By now, people had grown wary of the Hartwell household, a place where wives vanished into madness and silence. But Isabella was unlike Eleanor or Margaret. Where Eleanor had been delicate and Margaret disciplined, Isabella carried with her an almost feverish intensity. She had grown up fascinated with family histories, superstitions, and whispered tales of curses. Some said she had even pursued Edward precisely because of the rumors that clung to his name, believing she could unravel the mystery of his house. Isabella entered the mansion not with dread, but with curiosity. She was enamored with the old woodwork, the portraits of long, dead Hartwells, and the strange, shadowed corridors that seemed to wind farther than they should. She asked the servants endless questions about the house's history, pressing them about the two wives who had come before her. Most refused to answer, bowing their heads and muttering excuses. But rather than frighten Isabella, their silence thrilled her. She believed the house was keeping secrets from her, and she made it her mission to uncover them. Edward, for his part, seemed both annoyed and strangely satisfied by her curiosity. He watched her prowl through the house with a detached expression, as though waiting for her fascination to turn on itself. He offered no explanations, no reassurances, and never spoke of his past wives. Isabella mistook his coldness for mystery, and in her obsession, she began to weave Edward and the mansion together into a puzzle she was desperate to solve. The first true crack appeared late one evening when Isabella insisted on exploring the attic. The servants begged her not to go, claiming it was full of dust and rot, but she ignored them. With a lantern in hand, she ascended the narrow stairs, her skirts brushing against cobwebs. The attic was a cavernous space lined with trunks, broken furniture, and old portraits whose painted eyes followed her. As she wandered, her lantern light caught something peculiar. Scratches on the wooden beams, lines and markings carved as if in desperation. Some formed words, though many were half-finished, the letters jagged and frantic. She crouched down to trace them, her fingers following the grooves. Eleanor, silence, shadows. Then, deeper into the beam, the word Isabella, her name, carved long before she had even entered the Hartwell estate. She froze, her breath catching, before convincing herself it must have been some coincidence. Perhaps another Isabella had once lived here. Perhaps she was letting her imagination run wild. Yet as she turned away, she felt eyes watching her from the farthest corner of the attic, though when she raised the lantern, nothing stood there but shadows. From that moment, her obsession deepened. She began spending her nights poring through family records in the library, pulling out dusty volumes that smelled of mold and age. The Hartwells had always kept meticulous accounts, births, deaths, marriages, and Isabella traced patterns within them. She noted that many Hartwell wives died young, their causes of death listed vaguely as fever or nervous decline. Others vanished from the records altogether. She compiled lists, notes, and sketches in her own journal, convinced the house itself was part of some terrible legacy. The more she researched, the less she slept. Her eyes grew hollow, her handwriting frantic. Edward would pass her in the halls and glance at her with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps quiet contempt. He did not stop her. He never forbade her from searching. It was as if he were waiting for her to dig too deep. It was not long before the house began answering her questions. At night, when she wandered with her lantern, she would hear whispers fluttering just beyond her hearing. She strained to catch words, sometimes believing they spoke her name, other times convinced they were warning her away. In the dining hall, she once found a chair pushed out as though someone had just risen from it, though she was the only one awake. In her bedchamber, she awoke one night to find the portrait of Edward's father tilted askew, though no one had touched it. The servants avoided her more each day, crossing themselves when she entered a room. She asked them questions with urgency, but they responded only with lowered eyes. One young maid broke down, whispering that the house takes hold of women, and that Isabella should leave before it was too late. Isabella seized her by the wrist and demanded to know what had happened to Eleanor and Margaret. But before the girl could answer, another servant pulled her away, silencing her forever. Isabella's dreams became drenched in firelight and shadows. She dreamed of the attic again and again, of women standing in a circle with their faces obscured, their hands clawing at their throats. She dreamed of Edward sitting at the head of the dining table, smiling faintly while his wives shrieked silently around him. She woke with her sheets tangled, her body slick with sweat, and her nails broken from clawing at the mattress. Her obsession soon turned violent. She tore open trunks, scattering old dresses and crumbling books across the floor. She demanded keys to locked rooms, breaking them open herself when denied. She began confronting Edward, demanding he tell her the truth about his family. He would only smirk, his silence more terrifying than any answer. Then came the night she descended into the cellar. Few servants dared go there, claiming it was cursed, But Isabella had grown desperate. Lantern in hand, she wandered past rows of wine casks and into the farthest corner, where the stone walls were damp with age. There, she found more scratches of them, layered upon one another. Names carved into stone, each belonging to a woman. Eleanor, Margaret, dozens more. And at the bottom, a fresh space had been left, as though waiting for the next name. She dropped the lantern, its flame sputtering as she stumbled back. For a moment, in the flicker of dying light, she swore she saw women's faces pressed against the stone, their mouths moving silently, their eyes pleading with her. From that night onward, Isabella stopped sleeping altogether. She paced the halls with wild eyes, her journal clutched tightly to her chest, muttering fragments of her findings. Edward avoided her now, locking himself in his study, while she roamed the house like a restless spirit. The servants whispered that she had become worse than the wives before her, consumed not by silence or sorrow, but by knowledge too great for her mind to bear. When she finally disappeared, the town was unsurprised. Some claimed she hanged herself in the attic, though no body was ever recovered. Others said Edward had her committed, though no records of her arrival at any asylum existed. The mansion itself gave no answers. Only her journal remained. Its final pages illegible, the ink smeared as though she had written in a frenzy. In the margins of the last page, only one phrase was clear: "The house is alive, and it knows my name." Catherine arrived at the Hartwell estate under the shadow of whispers that had already darkened Edward's name. By the time she became his fourth wife, the town no longer tried to hide its suspicion. People spoke openly of curses, of women consumed by madness within those walls. Yet Catherine, unlike the wives before her, was drawn not by curiosity or love, but by the promise of security. She was practical, a woman of sharp mind and stubborn will, determined to carve stability from the storm that seemed to haunt the Hartwell family. At first, she maintained her composure. Catherine was not easily rattled by creaking floorboards or the occasional flicker of candlelight. She dismissed the superstitions of the servants, telling herself that grief, not ghosts, lingered in the house. When Edward regarded her with his cold detachment, she matched his silence with her own, refusing to play into his games of mystery. Where Isabella had chased answers, Catherine steeled herself against them, believing ignorance was her best shield. But the house was patient. It began subtly, gnawing at her edges. In the stillness of night, she would wake to the faint sound of someone breathing beside her, though Edward slept soundly, his chest rising and falling with eerie calm. At other times, she would hear her name spoken softly, the syllables floating in the air like a sigh. When she rose to investigate, the sound ceased, leaving her alone in the vast corridors. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of her tired mind, but the unease grew roots within her. Her first true unraveling came one evening when she found herself standing before the mirror in her chamber. She had been brushing her hair, her strokes even and calm, when she noticed her reflection hesitate. Her own arm, pale and trembling in the glass, seemed to falter half a second too late. She froze, staring into the mirror, her heart pounding. Her reflection smiled faintly, though her lips had not moved. Catherine staggered back, her brush clattering to the floor. When she blinked, the reflection was normal again, matching her every movement. She tried to convince herself it had been a trick of the candlelight, but she avoided mirrors after that, covering them with cloth as if shielding herself from her own face. Edward noticed her changes but offered no comfort. If anything, his silence seemed deeper, his eyes colder, as if he were watching the house claim her piece by piece. When she asked him directly if he believed his family was cursed, he only tilted his head and said, "Curses are for those who believe in them." His words gave her no peace. Catherine's practicality began to erode. She grew suspicious of the servants, convinced they were whispering about her in corners. She accused them of moving her belongings, of leaving her chamber door open at night. One maid swore she had seen Catherine wandering the halls barefoot, her eyes unfocused, whispering to unseen figures. Catherine, when confronted, remembered none of it. She would shake her head furiously, insisting she had been asleep in her bed. But when she returned to her room, she sometimes found mud smeared across the hem of her nightdress. Her dreams became violent, filled with shrieks and the pounding of fists against locked doors. She dreamed of drowning, her lungs burning while shadows pressed her beneath black water. More than once she awoke gasping for breath, clawing at her throat. The line between waking and dreaming began to blur, until even in daylight she caught herself hearing the echoes of water rushing in her ears. The descent quickened when she began speaking to the portraits. The Hartwell ancestors stared down from their gilded frames in every hallway, their painted eyes sharp and unyielding. At first, Catherine whispered to them in anger, demanding answers, demanding to know what they had done to the women before her. But soon the conversations turned one-sided, her voice cracking as she begged them for mercy. Servants reported seeing her standing before the portraits for hours, motionless, her lips moving in frantic prayer. Then there were the children's cries. One night, as she sat alone in the drawing room, she heard the faintest sob drifting through the walls. It was high-pitched, fragile, the unmistakable sound of a child. Her heart lurched. There were no children in the house, yet the cries grew louder, echoing down the hall. She followed them, lantern trembling in her hand, until they led her to a locked door in the west wing. The sobs were clearer now, so real that tears filled her eyes. She clawed at the lock, calling out, "I'm here. I'll help you." The door finally gave way under her desperation, but inside she found nothing but dust and broken furniture. The cries stopped instantly, leaving her alone in the silence, her chest heaving. By then, the house had fully taken hold of her. Catherine no longer slept. She wandered at all hours, muttering to herself, her once practical composure shattered into jagged fragments. She scratched strange symbols into the walls, markings that the servants later swore were the same ones carved by Eleanor in her final days. Edward did nothing to stop her. He merely observed, his cold eyes following her with the indifference of a man watching the inevitable unfold. One evening, a storm raged outside, lightning flashing through the tall windows. Catherine was found in the great hall, standing at the center of the rug with her arms spread wide, her face lifted toward the ceiling. Her voice echoed through the chamber, chanting words no one understood, words that seemed older than language itself. When the servants tried to pull her away, she shrieked and fought them with unnatural strength. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. She collapsed at last, her body trembling, her voice breaking into laughter that chilled the marrow of all who heard it. After that night, she vanished. The servants claimed she had walked straight into the storm, barefoot and unafraid, disappearing into the woods beyond the estate. Others whispered she was swallowed by the house itself, her voice now joining the cries and whispers that haunted the corridors. Edward offered no explanation, nor did he grieve. The townspeople, when they learned of her disappearance, nodded grimly. Another wife gone, another name to be whispered in fear. And yet, for those who lived near the Hartwell grounds, Catherine's presence did not fade. On stormy nights, some swore they could see her figure in the upper windows, her face pressed to the glass, her eyes wild with desperation. Others claimed that if you listened closely at the locked doors in the west wing, you could still hear the faint sobs of a child, followed by Catherine's broken voice murmuring, "I'm here. I'll help you." Louisa was the fifth and final wife, and by the time she entered the Hartwell estate, its reputation was already cemented as a place of ruin. The town whispered louder than ever, their voices heavy with pity and fear. No woman who had crossed the threshold of that house had returned whole. 3 had gone mad. 1 had vanished entirely, and the man at the center of it all, the cold and calculating Edward Hartwell, remained untouched, as though the darkness refused to touch him while devouring everyone else. Louisa, young and striking, was warned repeatedly not to tie her life to his. Yet she dismissed the warnings as gossip born of envy and superstition. She believed herself stronger, wiser, immune to the sickness that had destroyed the others. She was wrong. At first, life in the estate seemed ordinary, almost deceptively so. Louisa enjoyed the gardens, the high windows, the quiet of the countryside. Edward, though distant, offered her wealth and protection, and she accepted his aloofness as part of his nature. She had always been stubborn, priding herself on her ability to carve happiness out of difficult circumstances. When the servants eyed her with pity, she smiled confidently, brushing off their superstitions. "I'm not like the others," she told herself. "The house will not break me." But soon the unease began. It started as faint noises at night, soft enough that she could excuse them as creaks of an old house. Then came the footsteps, measured and deliberate, just outside her door when Edward was away. The first time she opened the door, lantern in hand, the hallway was empty, its shadows long and deep. The second time, she swore she saw a figure turn the corner, a woman in a pale dress that trailed along the floor. Louisa called out, her voice firm, but no reply came, and when she followed, the figure was gone. The servants avoided her questions. One finally muttered, trembling, that Louisa had seen one of them, though she refused to explain further. Louisa, her curiosity piqued, pressed for answers, but the servants scattered like frightened birds. It was Edward who finally told her, his tone casual, almost mocking. "You should not follow shadows in this house," he said. "Some things are meant to be left unseen." The way his eyes lingered on her then made her shiver. The figure returned again and again. Sometimes it stood at the foot of her bed when she woke suddenly in the night, its face blurred by shadow. Sometimes she glimpsed it reflected in mirrors, standing just behind her shoulder. And then one evening, while walking the halls, she heard her name whispered in a voice that was unmistakably female, soft but urgent, pulling her deeper into the west wing, the very part of the house the others had avoided. Louisa resisted at first, forcing herself to retreat, but the voice returned each night, growing stronger, more insistent. "Louisa, come." Eventually, she followed. The path led her to a locked door, the same one that had tormented Catherine. She pressed her ear to it and heard not one voice but many, muffled cries, sobs, and whispers overlapping in a terrible chorus. Her blood ran cold. When she pulled away, the whispers stopped, leaving only the silence of the empty corridor. Sleep deserted her after that. She roamed the house at night, pacing the halls like a restless spirit herself. The servants whispered that she was walking the path of the others, though they dared not say it where she could hear. Edward, cold and composed as ever, said nothing, though he seemed almost pleased by her unraveling. His indifference drove Louisa into greater desperation. She turned to Edward's study, determined to find answers where his silence gave her none. The study was locked, but Louisa was persistent. One night, when Edward was gone on business, she forced the door open. Inside she found shelves of books, thick with dust, their leather covers worn and strange symbols etched along their spines. She opened one at random and gasped. The pages were filled not with scripture or philosophy, but rituals. Incantations scrawled in languages she did not recognize, accompanied by diagrams of circles, chains, and symbols she had seen scratched into the walls by Catherine. At the back of the book, a list of names chilled her to the bone. Eleanor, Margaret, Isabella, Catherine, each name crossed out with ink, and beneath them in the same hand was her own Louisa. Her breath caught. She slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. That night, she confronted Edward. He did not deny it. Instead, he laughed, his voice low and venomous. "Did you think you were chosen for love?" he asked. "You were chosen because the house demands it. You are the last." His eyes gleamed with something inhuman, and Louisa felt terror coil inside her chest. She tried to leave the estate after that, but the gates would not open. The servants refused to help her, their faces blank, their loyalty rooted in fear. Louisa screamed at them, begged them, even threatened them, but they shook their heads. "It's the house," one whispered. "The house won't let you go." Her mind began to fray. The figure of the pale woman followed her constantly now, closer than before. Sometimes Louisa felt the woman's cold breath on her neck, or the weight of invisible hands pressing her shoulders. The whispers from the west wing grew louder, until she could not escape them no matter where she went. Even in her dreams, she was pursued, chased down endless corridors until she woke screaming, her throat raw. The end came suddenly. One stormy night, Louisa was found in the great hall, her hair disheveled, her eyes wild, clutching a knife. She shrieked at Edward, accusing him of feeding her to the house, of binding her to its darkness. Edward stood calm, unmoving, while Louisa ranted and raved, her voice breaking into sobs. The servants tried to intervene, but Louisa turned the knife upon herself, her final scream echoing through the estate as she collapsed to the floor. When dawn came, her body was gone. The knife lay in the center of the hall, bloodied, but no trace of Louisa remained. The servants whispered that the house had taken her, consumed her as it had the others. Edward, cold as stone, closed the book of his wives, their names complete at last. And so Louisa became the final piece of the Hartwell legacy. But those who passed by the estate in the years after swore that her screams had never faded. On nights when the wind howled, they claimed to hear a woman's voice crying from the windows, joined by the faint whispers of 4 others, a chorus of madness that would never end. The news of Louisa's disappearance did not travel the way most tragedies did in that small Kentucky town. It did not erupt in gossip, nor did it stir the usual flood of prayers and casseroles brought to the grieving widower's doorstep. Instead, a heavy hush fell over the streets, as if the very mention of the Hartwell estate could summon something unholy into their homes. Louisa was gone, just as the others had gone before her, and the people of the town responded the only way they knew how, by pretending it had not happened. The silence was not born of ignorance. Everyone knew the stories, whispered in corners and passed down to children who were warned to never wander near the Hartwell gates. They knew of Eleanor, the bright-eyed bride who sang in the church choir before her voice was lost to madness. They knew of Margaret, whose journals were found filled with frantic scribbles of demons clawing at her walls. They knew of Isabella, whose screams had echoed across the fields one fateful night before she was found lifeless and pale. They knew of Catherine, who vanished as though the earth had swallowed her whole. And now they knew of Louisa, though her fate was spoken of only in lowered tones, with the name itself avoided like a curse. Yet the sheriff never knocked on Edward Hartwell's door. The pastor never stood at the pulpit to condemn him. The townsfolk never gathered to demand answers. There was no investigation, no outrage, no justice, only silence. Some justified it by saying there was no evidence. Each wife had gone mad, it was true, but madness was not a crime. Catherine had disappeared, but so had many before her in the wild countryside. And Louisa, well, perhaps she had taken her own life, and Edward had simply chosen not to speak of it. That was the excuse people gave, but deep down they knew better. The Hartwell estate carried something far darker than mere tragedy. To confront it was to risk being swallowed by it. Children were forbidden from playing near the Hartwell grounds. Mothers pulled them close if they so much as glanced toward the road that led there. Farmers working the fields nearby claimed the crops closest to the estate grew twisted, their roots blackened as though poisoned by the soil itself. Travelers, unaware of the local legends, often stopped at the tavern for directions, only to be warned never to linger near the grand house on the hill. Keep your distance, the locals would say, eyes darting nervously toward the windows. The house remembers. Despite the fear, Edward Hartwell himself continued to move freely among them. He attended church on Sundays, sitting stiff and solemn in the back pew. He conducted his business at the market, purchasing food and supplies with quiet efficiency. He nodded politely when greeted, though his cold eyes rarely softened. Some whispered that the townsfolk tolerated him because they feared him, while others claimed they feared not Edward himself, but the thing that seemed to linger around him like a shadow. There were those who tried to resist the silence. A young deputy once suggested reopening the investigation into Catherine's disappearance, but the sheriff warned him off. "You don't poke at snakes," he said simply. The pastor, a man of deep faith, once prepared a sermon about sin festering within the community, but the words died on his tongue when he found himself unable to write Edward's name upon the page. One by one, those who considered speaking out against the Hartwells chose instead to stay quiet, as though the house itself had reached out to smother their voices. But silence breeds unease, and unease breeds rumor. At night, the tavern filled with murmurs of what truly happened to the wives. Some said Edward had poisoned them, slowly driving them to madness. Others swore the house was cursed, feeding on the women until it hollowed them out. A few even whispered that Edward had made a pact with something inhuman, and that each wife was merely another offering to keep that dark covenant fulfilled. The stories were endless, and though no one could prove them, they all carried a kernel of fear too potent to dismiss. It was not only the wives who haunted the townsfolk, but the legacy of silence itself. Parents feared for their daughters, especially those who caught Edward's eye. When he looked at a young woman in passing, her family would hastily make excuses to keep her away from him, sending her to distant relatives or marrying her off quickly, just to ensure she was not drawn into the Hartwell circle. Yet no one dared confront Edward directly, lest they draw the curse upon themselves. The servants of the estate, too, became ghosts among the living. Once they had mingled freely with the townsfolk, shopping in the markets, visiting relatives, and sharing in community events. Now they moved only when necessary, their eyes hollow, their lips sealed. When questioned, they gave evasive answers, speaking as though something bound their tongues. Some said they had been sworn to silence under threat of death, but others believed the servants themselves were trapped, just as the wives had been, bound to the house by forces beyond their comprehension. The silence stretched on, year after year, until it became part of the town's fabric. Newcomers quickly learned the rule: you do not speak of the Hartwells. The name itself was avoided in polite conversation. The house was referred to only as that place on the hill, and even then only with unease. Generations of children grew up knowing that some questions were not to be asked, some doors not to be opened, some stories not to be told aloud. And yet, beneath the silence, the memory lingered. On stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees, the people swore they could hear voices carried on the air. The weeping of women, the shriek of someone driven beyond sanity, the pleading of a soul not yet consumed. Those who lived closest to the estate claimed the lights within the house flickered, even when Edward was away, as though the ghosts of his wives roamed its halls, keeping their vigil of madness and grief. It was a silence that protected no one, for though the people believed themselves safe so long as they ignored the Hartwells, the fear still corroded them from within. They carried the weight of complicity, knowing that by saying nothing, by doing nothing, they had allowed the evil to endure. And Edward Hartwell, untouched by the suffering he had wrought, walked among them with impunity, a grim reminder that silence was its own kind of sin. Edward Hartwell had always carried himself with a sense of measured dignity, the kind that demanded respect without the need for loud words or overt gestures. To the outside world, he was a man of discipline, of intellect, a figure who seemed unshaken by the storms of life. But within the walls of the Hartwell estate, behind doors locked from the prying eyes of the town, Edward was a man unraveling, a soul descending into shadows too deep to claw back from. Those who saw him in town would not have guessed it. His coat was always pressed, his posture upright, his movements deliberate and precise. He spoke sparingly, but when he did, his voice was calm and low, almost soothing. He shook hands firmly, looked men in the eyes, and gave the impression of someone in complete control of himself. Yet control was the very thing Edward was losing bit by bit, consumed by a growing obsession with forces he could neither name nor deny. It had begun, he told himself, with Eleanor, his first wife. She was young, spirited, and deeply in love with him. He had adored her, perhaps more than he had ever adored anyone. But when her laughter began to falter, when her eyes grew hollow, when the whispers of madness took her from him, something inside Edward cracked. He had buried her, but he had not buried the gnawing question that tormented him. Why had she gone mad? What curse had stolen her light? And why, despite his prayers, had God remained silent? Edward sought answers in books, in sciences that most men of his time dismissed as folly. He purchased tomes from Europe, volumes filled with strange diagrams, symbols, and theories about the human soul. At night, long after the candles should have been extinguished, he pored over those pages, scribbling notes in margins, trying to piece together some logic behind the ruin of his wife. When Margaret followed Eleanor into madness, his obsession deepened. He no longer believed it was coincidence. The house itself, he suspected, was alive with something that fed on the women he brought into it. Yet, rather than flee the estate or destroy it, Edward convinced himself that the answer lay in understanding it. He told himself that his purpose was not cruelty but knowledge, not malice but discovery. If the house held power, then he would unravel it. If his wives were sacrifices, then their suffering was not in vain, for through them he would uncover truths hidden from ordinary men. That was the reasoning he whispered to himself when his conscience stirred, the excuse that allowed him to keep seeking more wives even as each one met a tragic fate. But with each death, each disappearance, Edward grew less like a man and more like a vessel for something darker. He began to hear voices within the walls, faint at first, like echoes of wind through the rafters. They grew clearer with time, urging him, instructing him, convincing him that he was chosen for a purpose greater than he could yet see. At first he resisted, terrified of what the whispers suggested. But isolation has a way of bending reason, and Edward, surrounded by his books and haunted halls, began to believe that the voices were not madness but revelation. He became consumed with ritual. The servants noticed changes, candles burning at odd hours, the master wandering the halls in the dead of night, muttering to himself in languages no one recognized. Rooms once kept locked were now filled with strange symbols drawn across the walls. circles of chalk that no broom dared to sweep away. The library, once filled with respectable volumes of history and philosophy, had transformed into a shrine of forbidden knowledge, and Edward, though still outwardly dignified, carried the weight of this secret life in his bloodshot eyes and sleepless frame. The townsfolk who passed him in church did not see this. They saw only a man who bowed his head in prayer, who donated quietly to the offering plate, who seemed composed despite the string of tragedies in his home. But if they had looked closer, they might have noticed how he lingered too long at the hymns, his lips moving though his voice made no sound. They might have seen how his hands trembled when holding the Bible, as though the weight of its words burned him. They might have noticed the faint smell of ash that clung to his clothes, the kind not born of hearth fires, but of burnt offerings. Edward's obsession reached its peak after Louisa vanished. He no longer mourned as he had with Eleanor, no longer wept as he had with Margaret. Instead, he withdrew further into the house, shutting himself away for days at a time. Servants carried food to his study, though often the plates returned untouched. He grew gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his eyes sunken. Yet there was a strange intensity in him, as if he had crossed into a realm beyond ordinary grief. Consumed by something both terrible and intoxicating, he began to believe the house itself had chosen him, that it had demanded sacrifice through his wives, and in return it offered him knowledge. The line between man and myth blurred in his mind. He was not Edward Hartwell, grieving widower. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of ancient truths. The townsfolk feared him, yes, but fear, he reasoned, was the mark of power. Those who feared him were acknowledging that he was no longer like them, no longer bound by their petty rules of morality or justice. But power came with its own price. Edward began to see things others could not. Shadows that lingered too long in corners, faces flickering in mirrors, hands brushing against him when no one was near. He heard his wives calling to him at night, their voices woven with both longing and torment. Some nights he swore he felt Eleanor's breath on his cheek, or Margaret's hand grasping his arm, cold and desperate. Whether these were specters or the inventions of his fractured mind, Edward could not say. He only knew that he could not escape them, nor did he truly want to. Their presence, however terrible, reassured him that he had touched upon something vast, something eternal, and so Edward's descent was complete. To the world he remained a man of composure, a figure both feared and respected. But within, he had surrendered himself to the darkness of his estate, to the voices that promised revelation, to the curse that demanded sacrifice. He told himself it was for knowledge, for purpose, for a truth greater than life itself. But in the stillness of night, when the voices grew quiet and the house lay heavy with silence, even Edward sometimes wondered if he had simply gone mad, if he was no different from the wives who had lost themselves before him. By the time Edward Hartwell's nights blurred into endless vigils before flickering candles, the house itself had begun to change. At least, that is what the servants whispered when they huddled in the kitchens, too afraid to voice such thoughts in the halls. The Hartwell estate had always carried an air of stern dignity, its architecture severe and unyielding, but now there was something heavier pressing down upon its walls, as though the wood and stone had absorbed too much grief, too much madness, and had grown swollen with it. The very air within its corridors seemed thicker, as if laden with unseen weight, clinging to the skin of anyone who dared to walk them. At first, these changes could be dismissed as tricks of the mind. Shadows lingered too long in corners. Floorboards groaned in the silence, their sounds oddly rhythmic, like breathing. A draft would coil through the hallways, but when one searched for its source, no window was open, no door ajar. The servants muttered about it, claimed the house was alive, but Edward dismissed them with a thin smile. And yet, behind his calm mask, even he began to feel that the estate was no longer merely wood, plaster, and stone. It was listening, watching, waiting. The portraits of long-dead Hartwell ancestors became unbearable to look at for too long. Their painted eyes, once mute with the indifference of oils and brushes, now seemed to glisten faintly, to follow movements across the room with uncanny precision. One maid, young and pale, swore she saw a smile curl on the lips of Edward's grandfather's portrait when she dared dust the frame. She never returned to work the next day, and no one in the town could say where she had gone. Some believed Edward had dismissed her quietly. Others whispered that the house had claimed her. Edward himself felt the shift most keenly in his study. He had long since turned it into a sanctum of his rituals. Littered with pages scrawled in his cramped handwriting, diagrams etched into the floor, and candles that burned even when the sun blazed high outside. It was here, in the silence between midnight and dawn, that he began to hear the house speaking. The voices of his wives no longer came from dreams but from the walls themselves. Their words carried in vibrations through the wood, in echoes that trembled beneath the plaster. At first, he pressed his ear against the panels, convinced he might be hallucinating. But when he felt the faintest pulse beneath the grain of the wood, like a heartbeat, he knew the house had awakened. The voices were pleading warning, begging him to stop, to leave, to burn the estate to the ground. But intertwined with those cries were other sounds, darker ones, low whispers urging him forward, promising that salvation, power, and understanding lay only a little further down the path he had chosen. And Edward, half mad with grief, half drunk on obsession, began to listen more to the whispers than to the pleas. He started to believe the house was not cursed but chosen, a vessel for ancient truths. The servants fled in increasing numbers, unable to endure the suffocating air, the endless unease, the feeling of being watched even in solitude. Those who remained told stories of footsteps in the halls when no one walked them, of doors locking themselves from the inside, of voices calling their names only to vanish when they turned. One young boy insisted he saw a figure of a woman in the parlor, weeping silently, her hands covering her face. But when he tried to touch her shoulder, she vanished into thin air. The boy left the estate that very night, refusing even his wages. Edward hardly noticed the dwindling staff. He had come to prefer the solitude, for the fewer distractions, the clearer the voices became. He spent hours pacing the halls, his fingers brushing along the walls, as if seeking communion with the house itself. His journal, once filled with tentative notes and scattered thoughts, grew dense with feverish writing. Pages crammed with diagrams of the estate's floor plan, symbols he claimed appeared to him in dreams, and lines of cryptic phrases that made little sense to anyone but himself. He began to write that the house was hungry, that it had fed well but not enough, and that it demanded more. Neighbors began to notice changes from afar. The once proud estate looked darker even in daylight, its shutters sagged though no storm had battered them. Its windows seemed tinted with a strange pallor, as if veils of shadow clung to the glass. Children dared each other to run up to its iron gates, but even the bravest refused to step onto the grounds. Some claimed they heard faint sobbing carried on the wind near the property, while others swore the trees lining the path bent unnaturally toward the house, their branches clawing at the sky. Inside, Edward's descent deepened. He lit fires in the hearths though the nights were warm, as though he needed flames to keep something at bay. He spoke aloud to the empty rooms, sometimes arguing, sometimes pleading, sometimes laughing in ways that echoed too loudly against the walls. He began to see his wives more clearly than ever before, no longer only in glimpses or shadows. They stood before him pale and trembling, their hair disabled, their eyes black voids of sorrow. Sometimes they screamed at him, their voices shrill with agony, shaking the very air. Other times they reached for him, as though begging him to follow. But always before he could touch them, they vanished. Yet Edward no longer recoiled. Where others would have fled in terror, he felt a terrible comfort. Their presence meant the house had accepted him, that he was part of something eternal. He told himself they were not truly suffering but transformed, bound within the estate as guardians of its secrets. He wrote in his journal that death was not an end but a merging, a return to the house itself. And if that were true, then his wives had not been victims but initiates, and he was not their destroyer but their shepherd. One night, as a storm raged across the countryside, lightning illuminating the estate in bursts of white, Edward stood in the great hall and swore he saw the house breathe. The walls seemed to swell, the air pushing outward as though the structure itself exhaled. The candles guttered and then blazed higher, though no hand touched them. The thunder rolled, but Edward did not flinch. Instead, he spread his arms wide and whispered, "I am yours." In that moment, he felt the heartbeat of the house not only in the walls but within himself, thrumming in his chest, binding him irrevocably to its will. From that night forward, there was no more Edward Hartwell, dignified widower, respected man of town. There was only Edward, servant of the house, custodian of its hunger, guardian of its whispers. The man had descended too far, and the house had risen too much, until the two could no longer be separated, and the estate, once merely a dwelling, had become a living prison of grief, madness, and secrets. By the autumn of that dreadful year, the Hartwell estate had grown into a subject of fearful fascination for the townsfolk. Few dared to go near it, yet all spoke of it. Its looming silhouette on the hill became a kind of dark sundial, marking the passage of days not with light but with dread. Where once the townspeople had respected the Hartwells, regarding them as a wealthy though eccentric family, they now whispered of curses, madness, and something unholy that stretched far beyond mere human affliction. Children, warned by their parents never to approach the grounds, still crafted stories about the house. They said that if you stood at the gates at midnight, you could hear women screaming, and if you lingered too long, pale hands would reach through the bars to drag you inside. The more imaginative among them claimed to see figures moving behind the shuttered windows. Though the estate had long been abandoned by all save Edward, the adults dismissed the tales outwardly, but deep down, they too believed the house had become something other than bricks and mortar. The town physician, Dr. Alcott, was one of the few to voice concern openly. He had treated the Hartwell wives during their respective descents into madness, and he had seen the toll it took on their bodies and minds. To him, it was not simply bad fortune but a pattern, a sickness rooted in the very air of that place. He warned the townsfolk that Edward should not be left alone. That grief and obsession had driven him too far. But his cautions fell on ears that did not want to hear. To interfere with Hartwell Manor felt like tempting fate, and so most believed it safer to leave the cursed family to their own ruin. But rumors began to spread of disappearances near the estate. A farmer's daughter who took the shortcut through the woods did not return. A traveling peddler was last seen walking up the road that led past the Hartwell gates. Two young men, emboldened by drink, dared each other to step onto the grounds one night and were never seen again. The town's patience began to fray. Fear had kept them still, but fear was slowly turning into suspicion, and suspicion into anger. It was the minister, Reverend Caldwell, who finally called a gathering. The church was crowded that evening not because the townsfolk sought comfort, but because they wanted answers. Candlelight flickered across faces drawn with worry, and the air was thick with murmurs. Caldwell spoke plainly. He recounted the deaths of the 5 wives, the strange sounds reported from the estate, the vanishings of innocents. He asked the gathered crowd how long they would allow one man and one house to haunt them. His voice shook not with uncertainty, but with conviction, as he declared that what lurked within the Hartwell estate was no longer merely a private tragedy. It had become a blight on the entire community. Some muttered that Caldwell was right, that something must be done. Others trembled at the suggestion, insisting that meddling would only invite ruin upon them all. "The Hartwell house feeds on the brave," an elderly woman cried, her voice cracking. "Those who go in do not come out." Still, beneath their fear was a growing recognition. The longer they turned their eyes away, the more the shadow of the house spread over their lives. That night, a small group of men resolved to approach the estate. They carried lanterns, crosses, and in some cases weapons. They were not brave so much as desperate, tired of the stories that grew darker with every passing month. When they reached the gates, the house loomed above them, its windows dark except for one faint glow in an upper room. The men hesitated. The iron gate was closed, though not locked. When one of them pushed it open, it groaned like something waking from a long sleep. They stepped onto the grounds, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots louder than they expected in the suffocating silence. The air grew colder as they neared the front steps, and one man swore he heard faint laughter carried on the wind. Another gripped his lantern tighter, muttering prayers under his breath. When they reached the door, they found it slightly ajar. None of them admitted aloud that it felt as though the house had been waiting for them. Inside, the stench of decay mixed with the waxy sweetness of melted candles. The men's lanterns revealed a hall stripped of its former dignity. Curtains hung in tatters, furniture was overturned, and on the walls, symbols had been etched in dark strokes. Some looked like crude drawings, others like languages unknown to them. The further they went, the clearer it became that Edward had transformed the estate into a place of ritual, a temple not to God but to something far older, something ravenous. They found his study door closed. When they pushed it open, the room was a chaos of parchment, melted wax, and dark stains that none dared identify. In the center of the floor, etched in chalk and blood, was a circle filled with runes. The fire in the hearth was still burning, though faintly, suggesting Edward was not far. One of the men bent to inspect the markings only to recoil, claiming the symbols moved when he stared too long. It was then they heard it, a voice echoing from deeper within the house. Low, guttural, almost inhuman. At first, they thought it was Edward, chanting some ritual, but as it grew louder, the walls seemed to vibrate with its tone. Their lanterns flickered, and the men felt their courage falter. They had entered with resolve, but now it was as though the house itself mocked them, daring them to press further. One man insisted they leave at once, that no good could come from staying. Another argued they could not return empty-handed, not after all the whispers and disappearances. Their debate was cut short when the voice changed. It became a chorus, many voices at once, rising in pitch until it was a wail that tore through the corridors. The lanterns went out all at once, plunging them into darkness. They fled then, stumbling over one another as they scrambled back through the halls, guided only by memory and panic. They burst through the front doors and onto the lawn, the cold air striking them like a rebirth. Behind them, the house stood silent again, its windows dark, as though it had swallowed its cries and returned to stillness. The men could not explain what they had heard, but when they returned to the town, their faces pale and their voices shaking, no one doubted them. The Hartwell estate was no longer a curiosity, no longer a whispered story of madness. It was a threat, alive and pulsing, and Edward Hartwell was its keeper. And so the town began to plan, not merely to gossip, not merely to fear, but to act. The question was not if they would confront the Hartwell house, but when, and whether they could muster the courage to face something that seemed less a man and a dwelling than a force of nature, waiting for its next offering. The decision to confront Hartwell Manor came swiftly after the failed venture of the lantern, bearing men. The town could not go on living in the shadow of the estate. Too many lives had been lost, too many whispers had become undeniable truths. Though fear still coiled in their bellies, the townsfolk understood that the longer they waited, the more powerful the house would become. And so they gathered, farmers with axes, blacksmiths with hammers, women clutching crucifixes and rosaries, an entire community steeled not by bravery but by desperation. Reverend Caldwell led them, his voice shaking with fervor as he declared that God would guide their hands and that no darkness, however ancient, could triumph over a righteous people united in faith. The night was bitterly cold, and a thick fog rolled down the hill as though the manor itself exhaled in anticipation. The procession moved slowly, their lanterns forming a trembling line of light against the suffocating blackness. When they reached the gates, they found them wide open, as though inviting the crowd inside. A shiver ran through them, yet no one turned back. They crossed onto the grounds together, and the gravel crunched underfoot like bones breaking. The house loomed above, its windows dark and blind, but the front doors stood ajar. Reverend Caldwell was the first to mount the steps, raising his cross high, and the others followed behind. As they entered, the air seemed to close around them. The stench of rot and wax was stronger now, and the once grand halls felt like the throat of some beast swallowing them whole. Their lanterns barely pushed back the dark, and strange shadows moved along the walls, though no one was near enough to cast them. They spread out cautiously, searching room by room, until they reached the great hall. There, waiting as though he had known they would come, stood Edward Hartwell. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish light. Around him were circles of symbols drawn in chalk and blood, some smeared, some fresh, and in the center of the room was a coffin chained shut with iron. The coffin groaned faintly, as if something within stirred. "You fools," Edward said, his voice low yet carrying easily through the chamber. "You come here thinking you can stop what has already been set in motion. My wives did not die in vain. They were vessels, sacrifices. Each scream, each madness fed him, and soon he will rise and none of you will matter." His words echoed unnaturally, as though more than one voice spoke through him. The townsfolk wavered. Some tightened their grip on their weapons, while others crossed themselves in terror. Caldwell stepped forward, his voice breaking but resolute. "You have damned yourself, Edward Hartwell. You've turned away from God and given your soul to something foul. We will put an end to it tonight." He raised his cross, and the crowd surged forward, their voices mingling in prayers and cries. Edward only laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that reverberated through the beams. As they advanced, the coffin rattled violently, its chains straining and screeching as though claws scraped from the inside. The air grew heavy, and a sound like thousands of whispers filled the room, crawling into the ears of those who listened too closely. Some dropped to their knees, clutching their heads, while others screamed in terror. Still, a handful pressed on. The blacksmith swung his hammer, shattering the edge of the ritual circle. Sparks flew, and Edward howled in rage, his voice no longer entirely human. He raised his hands, and the shadows on the walls lunged like beasts, clawing at the intruders. Lanterns shattered, plunging sections of the hall into deeper darkness, where people disappeared screaming into nothingness. The crowd fought desperately, smashing furniture, breaking symbols, dragging others back from the blackness. Caldwell moved toward the coffin, reciting scripture, his cross held high, though his own voice trembled with terror. The chains burst one by one, links snapping and clattering to the floor. A foul wind erupted from the coffin, extinguishing the last of the lanterns, leaving only the pale glow of Edward's burning eyes. "Too late!" Edward shrieked. "Too late!" "He comes." From the coffin rose a figure shrouded in shadow, its form shifting and grotesque, larger than any man yet bound by no flesh. Its eyes burned like coals, and its mouth stretched too wide, dripping with black ichor. The townsfolk screamed, some fleeing toward the doors only to find them sealed shut, as though the house itself refused to let them go. Caldwell dropped to his knees, reciting prayers louder, faster, desperate to call down a power greater than the thing rising before them. The shadow figure shrieked, its cry shaking the walls, shattering windows, making the very ground quake. The people clutched their ears, their voices drowned beneath the roar. But then, in a moment of desperate courage, the blacksmith and two others hurled their lanterns' oil across the coffin and struck flint. Flames leapt high, licking at the shadowed form. It shrieked louder, recoiling, its form twisting as if torn apart by the light. Edward screamed with it, his body contorting, his flesh splitting as though he too was bound to the monster. The fire spread across the hall, devouring wood, banners, and symbols alike. The townsfolk surged toward the doors, which at last burst open under the weight of their blows. They fled into the night, coughing and weeping, the glow of the burning house rising behind them like a second sun. From within the flames came the unearthly wails of both man and beast, a chorus of agony and fury, until finally the roof collapsed and silence fell save for the crackle of fire. On the hill, the manor burned through the night. The people stood below, watching in silence, their faces lit by firelight, unsure whether they had conquered evil or merely unleashed it. The screams had ceased, but the wind that rolled down from the flames carried a faint whisper, as though the house was not entirely gone. By dawn, only charred ruins remained. Reverend Caldwell, soot on his face and grief in his eyes, told the townsfolk that the curse was ended. They wanted to believe him, and so they nodded, clutching their families close. Yet each knew that what they had seen, what they had heard, could not be so easily erased. The Hartwell name would be remembered, not as a family but as a warning. Years later, no one rebuilt upon that hill. Travelers who passed by the ruins said they still felt eyes watching them from the scorched stones. Children told stories of screams on the wind, and the older generation shushed them quickly, afraid that speaking too much of the Hartwells might awaken something that slumbered still. The Hartwell line was extinguished, the house reduced to ash, but the tale lived on. It lived in whispers, in shadows, in the fear that some curses do not die with fire, but wait patiently in the ruins, dreaming of the day they might rise again.